He was the only GI to get the death penalty for desertion since the Civil War. At the tender age of 12, he started getting into trouble with the law. At 16, he had a rap sheet longer than some adult felons. When he was 18, he attempted to flee his home to avoid being drafted. It was here that Eddie's story truly began. Life on the front line was hell on earth. To say the conditions were bad would be an understatement. He explained that he was tired of fighting and didn't want to be killed or sent back to the front lines. In the meantime, Eddie continued to insist that he wanted to be court-martialed. He had confessed to the crime in writing and had been adamant about his intentions to desert. The judge advocate, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Summer, reviewed the evidence and found Eddie guilty of desertion. The maximum penalty was execution by firing squad. Summer recommended leniency, suggesting Eddie be given a dishonorable discharge and a prison sentence instead. But the final decision rested with Major General Norman Cota, the division commander. He was dressed in a standard-issue uniform and his hands were tied behind his back. "Go with God, son," the chaplain said softly. "I'm sorry," Eddie replied, his voice muffled by the hood. "Don't worry, son. I'm sorry, too," the chaplain said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But this is God's will, not mine. Go with God." With that, the chaplain stepped back and Eddie heard the click of the rifles being cocked. One by one, the rifle butts rose, aiming squarely at the spot between Eddie's eyes. A sudden bang echoed through the courtyard, followed by another and another. The sound of gunfire reverberated, each shot tearing through Eddie's body, ripping apart his flesh and bone. But it was over in a matter of seconds. Eddie lay slumped forward, his life extinguished in an instant. The firing squad had done its job. The escort led him through a maze of corridors and out into a courtyard, where a firing squad stood at attention. Eddie's heart pounded as he realized the gravity of the situation. This was it, the culmination of his turbulent journey. As he stepped into the center of the courtyard, Eddie looked up and saw a black hood being held out to him. Without a word, the guard motioned for him to put it on. Eddie hesitated for a moment, then pulled the hood over his head, plunging him into darkness. The hood muffled the sounds around him, amplifying his pounding heart and shallow breathing. Eddie's thoughts raced as he awaited his fate. He remembered his childhood, his loved ones, and the dreams he once had. Now those memories were all that remained. As the hours passed, it became clear that Captain Grott had to make a decision. In his official report, he stated that Eddie's actions constituted gross misconduct, especially at a time when the division was facing immense challenges and casualties. As the only American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War, his case sparked outrage and controversy. Supporters of his execution argued that it was necessary to maintain military discipline and deter other potential deserters. Critics, however, claimed that Eddie's actions were the result of severe mental trauma and that capital punishment was an extreme and inhumane response. In the aftermath of Eddie's execution, his story continued to resonate. People questioned the circumstances surrounding his trial and the adequacy of his defense. Was Eddie truly given a fair chance to present his case? Did he receive proper legal counsel? Or was he a victim of circumstance, swept up in a system that demanded obedience above all else? These questions fueled ongoing debates about the ethical boundaries of capital punishment, the psychological toll of war, and the importance of due process. Cota argued that punishing Eddie leniently would undermine military discipline and morale, and could encourage others to desert. He became increasingly agitated and paranoid, believing that guards were poisoning his food and plotting against him. On the night before his execution, he refused to eat or sleep, pacing his cell restlessly. Eddie spent his last night alive praying, reading the Bible, and writing letters to his family, expressing his innocence and asking for forgiveness. He also expressed his belief that he was being treated unfairly, and that his execution was politically motivated. Eddie's thoughts raced as he contemplated the events that had led him to this moment. He thought about his childhood, his criminal career, and the series of unfortunate events that had led him to the gallows. He wondered if things would have turned out differently if he had listened to his mother, joined the church choir instead of the street gang, or avoided that fateful fight that landed him in jail. As dawn approached, Eddie's emotions shifted from fear to anger. He began shouting and cursing, railing against the injustice of his situation and denouncing those who had condemned him. He paced his cell, unable to find solace in prayer or reflection. The realization that there was no escape, no last-minute reprieve, filled him with dread. Yet there was a strange sense of calm amid the storm. Eddie knew that his life was ending, but he was strangely unafraid. He had faced death before, either in the form of combat or certain parts of his life, and now he embraced it, certain that whatever came next was better than the torment he endured. He ultimately approved the death sentence, sending a clear message that desertion would not be tolerated. Eddie wouldn't back down and seemed willing to face the consequences of his actions. Over the next month, he saw a steady stream of visitors, including chaplains, psychologists, and senior officers. Most were there to try to convince Eddie to recant his decision and plead for clemency. Eddie, however, remained defiant, insisting that he had done nothing wrong and deserved his sentence. Ultimately, Captain Grot radioed headquarters and informed them of the situation. He explained that Private Slovik had threatened to desert and refused to return to his unit unless he was transferred to a rear area support role. The captain stressed that this was unprecedented behavior and requested guidance on how to proceed. Headquarters responded that the decision was up to Captain Grot, and he should do what he felt was necessary. With no other options, Captain Grot decided to charge Eddie with desertion. Despite the seriousness of Eddie's claims, Captain Grot initially thought he was joking. However, when Eddie insisted and handed him a written statement detailing his intentions, it became clear that he was serious. Eddie told the captain that he was prepared to be court-martialed and was ready to accept any punishment. Captain Grot, stunned by what was happening, tried to dissuade Eddie from following through with his plans. He pointed out that deserting during wartime was punishable by death and urged him to reconsider. But Eddie was adamant, stating that he had made up his mind and would do whatever he felt he needed to survive. While serving in the 28th Infantry Division, Eddie was involved in some of the bloodiest battles of the war, including the liberation of Paris and the Battle of the Bulge. Over a matter of months, he went from an inexperienced rookie to a seasoned veteran who had seen his fair share of horrors. When the Second World War broke out, he was shipped off to Europe and within weeks deserted. There are a few theories as to why Eddie deserted. Some believe he was traumatized by the horrors of war and simply snapped. Others claim he was always a troublemaker looking for an excuse to cause trouble. Whatever the reason, Eddie's decision would cost him his life. Today we'll explore the story of Private Eddie Slovik, the most extreme example of wartime desertion in American military history. We'll look at what he did, why he did it, and the tragic consequences that followed. This is the story of America's only executed deserter of World War II and the controversy surrounding his case. Let's start at the beginning. Eddie Slovik was born in Detroit, Michigan on March 8, 1920. His parents were working-class Eastern Europeans who struggled to keep food on the table. They tried their best to raise Eddie, but it was an uphill battle. As Eddie grew older, he started skipping school and hanging out with the wrong crowd. At 12, he stole his first car and was charged with joyriding. At 16, he ran away from home and broke into houses to sustain himself. As he moved through his teenage years, he racked up arrests for burglary, robbery, and fighting. By the time he was an adult, he had been sentenced to prison more times than he could count. It might seem like a stretch that this troubled teen would become the most infamous American soldier of World War II. His life was going down a dangerous path. So when the draft came around in 1942, he tried everything he could to avoid serving. First, he registered for conscientious objector status on the grounds that he was a pacifist, but this was rejected. Then he claimed to have asthma, hoping to be declared unfit for service, but this was swiftly dismissed. Desperate, he fled to Canada. While there, he enlisted in the Canadian Army under the false name of Joseph Labadie, but was soon caught and deported back to the United States. With all other options exhausted, Eddie knew the long arm of the law would catch up with him soon. So he turned himself into the local draft office and accepted his fate. In January 1944, Eddie was classified for F and sent to Europe, where he was assigned to the 28th Infantry Division stationed in France. So it came as little surprise when he decided to desert. On December 1944, while on patrol, Eddie encountered Captain Ralph Grot, the company commander, and told him that he planned to desert. Captain Grot, unsure of how to proceed, radioed headquarters for instructions and waited for further orders. Eddie's court-martial was held 2 days later on December 1944. The evidence against him was overwhelming. After reviewing the case, General Cota agreed with the guilty verdict, but rejected the recommendation for leniency. Following the court-martial, Eddie was sent to the division jail at Orleans, France, awaiting his execution. As the date of his execution drew closer, Eddie's mental state began to deteriorate. On January 31st, 1945, Eddie was awakened early in the morning by armed guards who escorted him out of his cell. Suddenly, A voice broke the silence. It was the chaplain who had visited Eddie several times, Eddie Slovik's execution was a pivotal moment in military history. Thanks for watching.